So Erwin, welcome.
Yes.
Tell us a bit more about the whole story. What are the facts? What's the emotion? Should we be concerned, etc.?
Well, there are a number of intertwined issues in your introduction, Professor Roux. As it happens, one of these aspects has to do with constitutions and constitutionality. There are aspects then related to that in terms of the way in which we deal with land and land reform. And then there are issues about leadership and how leadership impacts on the political economy. So a number of these integrated, fairly complicated, even complex issues. So let's start at a particular point. First of all, our constitution is a negotiated constitution, and the result of the constitutional negotiations which we had in the early 1990s. And therefore, it is a strong constitution with a lot of safeguards. It is, and I think that is the first important point, it is not easy to change the constitution. In some cases, where you want to change the constitution, you even need a majority of 75% of the National Assembly, that is the combined houses of Parliament. In some cases, it's 66%. In the case of land and anything to do with property, it is a 66% majority. And there are serious processes that have to be dealt with and particularly well managed to change the constitution. Now, secondly, one must also realize that those safeguards were built into the constitution because property is a central concept. Since the Roman law and through a number of global, international and South African national systems. So property is a central institution. And property as a central institution in the political economy then underpins a number of not only political but also economic and specifically commercial aspects. For example, if you start dealing with property in a way which substantively changes the fact that those who have property have rights to them, then you impact on the banking system, you impact on the law of contract, you impact on the laws related to all of the aspects of property as surety. So in that sense, it is a huge systemic potential impact if you change the relationships of people to property. Therefore, it is safeguarded in the Constitution. Now, if we take the idea of land reform in our Constitution provided, due to the negotiated settlement we had, that land cannot be expropriated without a willing seller and willing buyer principle, which means that the government can expropriate land, for example, agricultural land, but they must make an offer which creates a willing seller. And that is a problem. That creates a problem because that means that you inevitably get people who uses that in a way where they drive up the offer that they want, and it makes the expropriation of land for redistribution purposes expensive. So there is an issue there. There is also another part of the Constitution which basically says that under conditions of public interest, it is possible to go beyond that. So if you want to build a road or a dam, and you must expropriate a piece of land for that, then there is a provision for that. But that was not done on the basis explicitly to enhance land redistribution for agricultural and giving it from one owner to another owner. It was for public services purposes built into that. But that gives an opportunity. Now, we know that there is still a hugely skewed distribution of land situation in South Africa. There are different data sets and different interpretations, but if you look at some data sets, then people who argue from a particular vantage point, and that vantage point is we must redistribute land radically, it's part of radical economic transformation, then they will argue there's about 95% of land, and especially agricultural land, still in the hands of basically white farmers, whether commercial or otherwise. Other people will say if you add in the aspects of government land, if you add in aspects of land in the hands of, for example, the Ingwavuma Trust, who owns 2% of the South African land in KwaZulu-Natal, there are numbers of different takes on this particular data set. And it depends on your political affiliation and ideology, which one you accept and which one you drive. So, land is extremely skewly distributed in South Africa. So we must find a way. A next part that links into the governance issues. We have had land reform in this country for 25 years, close to 25 years, but it was, and there's an argument in that regard which is a solid argument, it was particularly badly governed, as are many public governance services. And therefore we could have been much more advanced on this pathway of land reform if governance was good, effective and ethical. But that also didn't happen. So we end up in a kind of a perfect storm. More and more political pressure, not well-governed systems, and then inevitably the argument starts to say we need another land reform model. And I think that is a given. However, does that mean that we have to expropriate everybody's land? And remember, if you go to land expropriation, you're not far away from property expropriation, and the next step is property is not defined only as physical property, but intellectual property, commercial interest, and so on. So it is a slippery slope that must, not at all costs, but must be managed extremely well. Now, then you come to the leadership issues. There are leaders, and one can actually fairly safely say that the previous president of South Africa, President Zuma, had a particular approach to this, also given the fact that he was part of a particularly badly governed system which created pressures, and that leads into political behavior to retain your support within your constituencies on the one hand, and then you do that by means of promising people things and all of a sudden becoming somewhat more radical in order to buy off political support. That would have been the most disastrous way. However, unfortunately, we have now got a new leadership in the ANC, and particularly in President Cyril Ramaphosa. And immediately the framing of the argument changes. The ANC National Elective Conference decided, amongst others, that they want land expropriation without the willing buyer, willing seller, without compensation. There can never be no compensation, but it's more around the willing buyer and seller. The EFF, Economic Freedom Fighters, then takes that as a solid approach to gain support in a fairly populist, nationalist and socialist way. One wonders whether that doesn't actually define National Socialism. However, that is a debate. And now President Ramaphosa has to deal with all of these contingencies. And what he does is he takes a guarded and strategic approach. He says, yes, we have to do something, and we have to do something which is substantive. We will not necessarily admit for political reasons that we had bad governance, but we have to improve the governance. And then he says, and he invokes, and that closes the loop, the Constitution. He says we will do this under the Constitution. Currently it means there will be no land grabs. You cannot defy the Constitution because you want to inform the Constitution or use the Constitution. You cannot use the law to act against the law. So in the meantime, no land grabs. And then over and above that, the processes of going through public participation processes, the constitutional process of getting the land clause amended in the very strict way it has to be done. And then thereafter, an approach which has to be well governed. And the whole framing of the argument is still concerning because, as I've said, if you open the Pandora's box of, the sorcerer's apprentice getting involved with very, very complex issues, you may actually get it completely wrong, as happened in Zimbabwe. However, I don't think that is what is happening in South Africa. I think there is a need for an upscaled and a speedier approach to substantive land reform, but I think there is also responsible leadership. I think there will be compromises made, and I think finally the constitutional dispensation will be respected, either in terms of acting in terms of the current constitution for as long as it is the constitution, or changing the constitution in a way which will create losers and winners, but hopefully not total losers and winners. But then finally also governing and implementing these things in a way which is proper. Concluding remarks, unless Professor Roux has more questions, which probably he has. Concluding remarks is, of course, that we also must take note that in many cases people who get land, real access and possession of land, under all of these measures, do not actually use the land well. So there's a strong drive also to, when you redistribute land, to make sure that it is accompanied by building the competencies to ensure food security and competent farming, and that can be done. And then also we realize that in many cases there are also opportunistic land claims, where people say we lay a claim to land, but we actually don't want land, we want money. And once you've had the money and the money has been spent, then you are still where you are. So even there's a need for wise measures for those not only who lose, but also those who are going to gain. Otherwise it will again be dysfunctional and disruptive.
Thank you. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but could one say that you are essentially saying that you believe reason will prevail, the Constitution will be respected, and therefore, and maybe I'm wrong here, maybe we don't have to get too overexcited or too emotional at this stage? Well, we're not looking at this stage at a Zimbabwe scenario.
Exactly. I think what we see is a consistent approach which invokes the rule of law as an institution, the Constitution and constitutional government in a democratic and justiciable constitution, because we've not spoken about the courts that can get involved, and then a governance leadership which realizes that it is not a good idea to drive South Africa in a number of potentially conflictual societal entities, and therefore takes a responsible approach and says it cannot sustain as it is, but we have to do it in a way which serves the best interest in a compromised way of everybody. So the whole idea of land grabs, Zimbabwe style, is not imminent, and I don't see that that will happen. There will be isolated cases, as we've already seen, driven by political aspirations and sheer opportunism. However, in most cases, those will be dealt with in terms of the Constitution, and finally the constitutional dispensation gives the power and authority to the law enforcing agencies, and people will definitely be evicted from that land, as we have also seen. It is a predicament when all of a sudden 3,000 people settles on your 5-hectare plot outside of the urban area, and that might be difficult to deal with, but the intention is to deal with it from the side of government.
Well, just one, perhaps, or maybe two quick final questions. What's the next big red flag in the whole process, or white flag to look out for? When does this erupt again as a talking point?
Well, if it's about land reform, I think the red flag is if there are a growing number of significant examples of land grabs without following a proper constitutional process, and then secondly, the instruments of law and order, which starts with basically the police in whichever format through to the courts, start to fail in that sense, which then leads to further failures around, the commercial institutional values of land and the links to surety and the banking system. Then you've got a serious set of systemic issues. White flags are that it is currently a process in debate. The President, in a question and answer session in Parliament yesterday, the 14th of March of 2018, said that we have to have a negotiated settlement here. And the white flag is also that the President is himself an interesting mix of a member of the South African Communist Party, but also a big industrialist, commercial landowner and understands these things in a more sophisticated way. Thirdly, the president is now in power. He doesn't have to compete for power in a way which sort of destroys the power base which he wants to lead. So I think there are a number of white flags, and for me, the balance of probabilities are that there will be people who lose and there will be people who gain, but I don't think we're going into anything like a potential destructive, disastrous situation.
And I think that is the perfect answer to the question, so what? Thank you, Erwin.
Thank you.